Canada is getting a new national statutory holiday, but it's not to celebrate an occasion. Instead, it's a day to remember and reflect on the tragic legacy of the residential school system. Instituting the holiday was a recommendation made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Today, the federal government revealed it's consulting with Indigenous leaders to decide which day of the year should be chosen for the commemoration. So, how significant is this step? Joining me now, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Perry Bellegarde. Hi, National Chief Bellegarde. Great to have you back on the show. From your perspective, why is it important that a day be set aside to mark what happened in residential schools and to the survivors of residential schools?
I think it's very important to mark that day because I've always said education and awareness leads to understanding, will lead to action. And the residential schools is one of Canada's dark spots. It's a dark history. It's a dark chapter. I don't call it cultural genocide of our people. I call it genocide because that's what the residential schools tried to do. It tried to wipe out First Nations people. And so to have a day, you know, in terms of truth and reconciliation, it's part of truth telling. That's very fundamental and important if we want to get to reconciliation. This is what happened. This is what actually happened to my dad and my grandpa and my great-grandparents. Like, this is what happened. And we need all Canadians to learn from that. And I always say this point, let's learn from the past. We don't need to live there, but let's learn so that we can chart a better future for our children and grandchildren.
There is some discussion over what day this ends up falling on. What's your take on that?
Again, we'd like to be involved in picking the date. You know, I don't know what's the best date. We take that back to our leadership, our chiefs. It could be in September, it could be in October, it could be June 20. Like, we need a dialogue about that. The important thing is that it's going to happen. And I think it's more important to focus on why it's going to happen. It's going to be a statutory holiday for all Canadian people to mark truth and reconciliation and learn and understand the impacts of the residential schools. That's one day. I've also said, let's build upon that and let's change the school curriculums so that every school from kindergarten to grade 12 knows about the residential schools and has its impact so that, again, we learn from the past, we don't live there. We have to chart the next 150 years. And so there's no better way than education awareness, understanding will lead to action. And that action can be policy changes, legislative changes, even how people view and think about First Nations people, how they have their viewpoints. That can change. And that's very powerful when you want to build a better country.
On the education piece, do you think that that it should be a day off, as some stat holidays are, depending on what province you're in,
Sure.
or should it be kids have to go to school that day? They have, you know what I mean? Do you have a preference on any of that?
Don't have a preference on it. Like, I think let's build that education awareness component, you know, so that it's like people get days off, statutory holidays, and they just, oh, it's a stat holiday, it's Victoria Day. Well, there's reasons why these are statutory days put in place in the first place. And this stat holiday, to me, is very important. You know, even our Chiefs of Canada have been talking about this since 2010. They've passed the AFN Chiefs resolution calling for a stat holiday to do the truth and reconciliation regarding the impacts of the residential schools. And so it's 8 years later, it's happening. It's all about educating Canadians. Learn from the past, don't live there, so we can chart a better future together for our children and grandchildren. And that's what it's about.
There is some reaction, obviously, to the news to this today, including from Conservative MP Maxime Bernier, who ran for the Conservative leadership and didn't win. He's had some controversial tweets lately about other subjects, primarily focused on the government's message around diversity. This is what he had to say in response to the Globe and Mail story that originally reported this idea of the holiday. Why not celebrate instead the heritage and renewal of Aboriginal cultures? That would unite us in a positive way. Cult of victimhood and obsession with past wrongs instead of focus on the progress made and to come are another sick characteristic of extreme PC and multiculturalism. What's your response to that?
Well, I was quite disappointed in Mr. Bernier's tweet. And to me, it shows his ignorance about the impact, the real impact of the residential schools. And it's not about victims. You know, we're not First Nation. Oh, the First Nations playing the victim card again. It's not that at all. Like, the impact of the residential schools was immense. It was a genocide of a people. And it's like I made comments earlier on to talking with people about, you know, like the travesty when the women were killed at Polytechnique. Nobody says they were playing the victim card. You know, or the Holocaust, when we remember the Holocaust and the Jewish people and what they suffered at the genocide there. They don't say they're playing the victim card. So to have Mr. Bernier say this about First Nations people, very ill-informed, total lack of sensitivity or awareness or understanding about the huge impact of the residential schools in a negative way on First Nations people. It was a genocide of our people. So for him to say that, he has to do some soul searching, and maybe he's just trying to do things to get attention. He did get beat.